Hi, and welcome to our first, I hope it's our last, virtual classroom session. This is for the class we would have had on January 28th, Wednesday morning at 9:30. I'm going to break our session into 4 segments. In the first segment, I will talk about how to write an essay so that you can start writing on your paper. And I'll also talk about the Blackboard discussion that will be your homework assignment that will be due on Friday, January the 30th. In the second section, I will talk about books 11 and 12 of the Odyssey. In the third segment, I will talk about books 13 through 15. You skipped 14, but I will cover a couple of things that I think are salient from that book. And then in the last fourth section, I will talk about books 16 through 17. I will be posting your homework as usual on Blackboard, but I'll talk a little bit in this segment about how to do the Blackboard discussion since we've not done that before. I really regret that I can't point to Blackboard and show you where it is, but I'll try to talk you through it. But let's start with writing an essay. First of all, I want to point out that there is a very helpful PowerPoint that I created. Of course, I think it's helpful. This time, instead of publishing it under PowerPoints, I put it in the section of Blackboard called Writing Aids. The reason I did that is that whole menu item, that whole page, is devoted to things related to writing an essay. So there are 2 PowerPoints there. There also are suggested topics for essay numbers 1, 2, and 3. There's some reference materials on paragraph transitions. So I try to put it all in one place to make it a little bit easier for you. The segment that we're going to go over is called Writing an Essay. I regret that I can't bring up the PowerPoint, but I'll try to talk you through it. You'll want to go through the PowerPoint on your own because it also contains some examples. I actually wrote an essay myself and then chopped it up into pieces and put segments of it into the PowerPoint so that you could see examples of what I'm going to talk about. I can't do that here in this forum, so I'll just give you an overview of the portions of an essay. First of all, it's important to understand that writing an essay in college is different than in high school. In high school, you might be trying to explain something. That's called an expository essay. In this case, you're actually doing literary analysis. So it's different because you're trying to prove something based on your interpretation of events in the text. So you're not just saying, here's an example of what happened, but you're actually interpreting the event in the text or the thing, the symbol in the text. So let me talk about structure. I like to think of it like an Oreo cookie. Food examples are always a great thing to work with. Um, if you think about how an Oreo cookie is constructed, you have the chocolate cookie on the top and on the bottom. And whether you're a cream kind of person or a chocolate cookie kind of person, you have to admit that without that solid layer on the top and on the bottom, you'd have quite a mess if the whole tray of Oreos were nothing but the cream middles. It might be really tasty, but it would be really hard to handle. And that's exactly how an essay works. You need the intro and you need the conclusion to make the whole thing hang together. And I will explain why. That creamy, gooey stuff is the body of your paper, and that's the real good stuff. That's where you lay out your argument. But without the top and bottom, it won't hold together. So those portions are really important. And sometimes students overlook that. They're so excited to get to proving my argument that they don't set it up really well. And when you take that into the working world, I really am trying to prepare you for the working world, you can equate this to writing an email to your boss. You're trying to convince your boss of something. Well, you have to lay out what you're talking about first. You have to say, I think we should open a new office in San Francisco, or I think I'm the best candidate for that business trip, or we're going to make a great presentation to a client. You need to be able to set the groundwork, otherwise your boss doesn't know what you're talking about. And ditto for the conclusion. When we get to the conclusion, I'll talk a little bit about why that's so important. So starting with the introduction, you have to pretend that you're writing the paper not for me, but for an academic audience out there. What I'm teaching you to do is to write in the way you would if you were going to be published in an academic journal. And in most cases, your audience, your readers, are people who haven't read the book. that you're writing about, or the film, or the play, or in this case, the epic poem. So you have to give them enough background that they can understand what you're talking about. So first of all, somewhere near the top, whether it's the first sentence or the second sentence, you have to identify which work you're talking about and who wrote it. Now that seems obvious in this case because I assigned the paper and I told you to write on the Odyssey. But if you were publishing this paper somewhere up front, you'd have to say Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey. So make sure that that's in your first or your second sentence. Then, assuming that your audience hasn't read the work, you have to provide background to set up whatever your thesis is about. So if you think about the Odyssey on the whole, you could probably summarize what the book is about in just one sentence. Imagine yourself if your roommate saw that big honking book that you're carting around and said, "Yeah, what's that book about anyway?" How would you answer that question? You might say something like, "Well, it's the story of this guy, Odysseus, who's king of Ithaca, who was in the Battle of Troy, and he's trying to make his way home, and it takes him 10 years." That would probably be something like your answer. You might say it more colorfully than that, but that's the point. So you're going to start your introductory paragraph by talking very broadly about what the Odyssey is about. Then you have to aim for your thesis. So your introduction is going to be different than someone else's because you're trying to tell your reader what the reader needs to know to focus on your thesis. So let me give you some examples. If you were writing about Penelope, you would open by saying it's the story of Odysseus making his way home after the War of Troy. But then you would also have to say, meanwhile, his wife Penelope, who's been waiting almost 20 years for him, remains convinced that he could be alive, and she's not willing to remarry. She's being pressured by these suitors who want to marry her because they want to become king. And they want to do it quickly because her son is coming of age. So before he can become king, the suitors are pressing her to marry one of them so that they can be king and basically take the kingdom away from the son Telemachus. So do you see, you would have to set up the story in that way so that when the reader gets to your thesis, the reader knows who Penelope is, who Telemachus is, and who Odysseus is, so that they can make sense of the examples that you're going to give. And they need to understand the circumstances because the suitors are going to be part of your story about Penelope. If you were writing about Telemachus, by contrast, you would be talking about how old he is, the fact that he hasn't seen his father because his father sailed away when he was just an infant, and that now that he's coming of age, there are these men who are trying to cheat him out of his throne, and he really doesn't have anyone to help him, so the goddess Athena comes along. She may feel a little bit guilty because she was with his father, and his father was separated from him, so he didn't get the kind of formation that he really needed to become an effective king. So Athena has come now to try to make up for that. And then you would talk about the journey that she was sending him on. So your introduction is basically going to be like a funnel. It's going to start with a really broad portion talking about what the Odyssey is about, and then you're going to narrow it down based on which portion of the story that you're focusing on. Your aim at the bottom of that funnel is to get to your thesis statement. So your thesis statement is going to be at the very end of your introductory paragraph. And usually the introduction will be just one paragraph. It could be more than that, but typically it would be one. Next we get to that creamy, ooey gooey stuff, the body. I knew you were waiting for that. The body you have to think of like a court case. If you liken it to a court case, your readers are the judge or maybe the jury. You're trying to convince them of your point of view. I talked earlier about a scientific experiment and how a thesis is different than a hypothesis in that a hypothesis needs some experiment to prove it. In this case, you already have all the data. The data is in the book, whatever examples you're going to pull out of the book. So what you're doing is you're taking facts that you're going to present to your jury, but you must interpret them. You can't just put them out there and say, Odysseus did this, Telemachus did that, Penelope did this. You need to say, Penelope did this, and here's what it indicates. Here's what it shows us. And this is proof that. So you're setting up your body to be the proof, laying out your case to your audience. So you're going to give, I wrote here 3 examples, but you could have 4, however many you need to get to your, the length of the paper will be 3 to 4 pages. 4 examples obviously are more compelling than 3, but you need a minimum of 3. In academia, 1 example doesn't prove anything. 2 examples are pretty much a coincidence. So you need at least 3 to prove that there really is a pattern here. Otherwise, it's like, yeah, so coincidences happen all the time. So your examples are basically pieces of evidence. At this point, I have not yet taught you how to write parenthetical citations. So as you're pulling your examples together, simply make a note of which book, and by book I mean essentially the chapter here, and line number. For a poem, we do not use page numbers. Typically, a poem doesn't have multiple books like this, so you would simply be using line numbers. But in this case, the line numbers start over at the beginning of each book. So you're going to need the book, like book 9, lines 227 through 229. Make a notation of that next to your example as you're putting your examples together, because you will have to cite that. Even if you're not quoting, you need to tell your reader where you got this evidence. In academia, someone might want to go and check it out because they might say, I read that book a long time ago and I don't remember it that way. I want to check this out. You need to tell them where to find it. For English and for foreign languages, we follow MLA guidelines. MLA stands for Modern Language Association. It can be confusing because if you're writing papers for other classes, like say a psychology class, you would be using a different set of guidelines. The APA guidelines apply to psychology papers. For math and science, there are other standards. So under MLA guidelines, the MLA prefers that we minimize quotes. And this may be different from what you were taught elsewhere, including in high school, but also in other college classes. So quotes are useful only in very limited circumstances. We prefer that you paraphrase. The reason for that is that your voice is different from anybody else's. I mean your writing voice. So as a reader, imagine me, just as an example, reading your paper, and then it flips to a quote from Homer, and then it flips back to your voice. I feel sort of like a ping pong ball. One voice, another voice, your voice, his voice, back and forth and back and forth. It's very jarring to the reader. So we try to minimize the use of quotes. There can be times when they're very, very powerful. I'll give you an example. If you're talking about how Telemachus sounds after the first time he meets Athena, and you're trying to make the point that he sort of lips off to his mom, and he's sort of sassy to her, although in his view he's probably trying to be helpful, he comes across as rather condescending. It's one thing to say that, but it's much more powerful if you actually take the quote from the text where he says things like, tend to your distaff and your loom, and the men here will make the decisions, and I, most of all, in this house. That language is so powerful, and it so strongly demonstrates the tone of voice that he's using with his mother. So when you're talking about tone of voice, it's very important to use a quote. Another example might be when Odysseus is dealing with the Cyclops, and after he manages to escape, he's blinded the Cyclops, and he taunts him. The language that he uses there is very powerful, and it shows just how strong his pride is. So in that case, the quote might make a lot of sense. But when you're simply telling a story, like if you were telling the story of how Penelope fools the suitors by her weaving, there's no reason to use the quote. So think carefully about whether a quote is necessary or if simply telling that portion of the story in your own words might make more sense, and it's easier on your reader's eye. Now we come to the final part, and admittedly, by the time you get to the end of your paper, you're really exhausted. It may be, 3 o'clock in the morning, the day the paper's due, and you just want to be done, and you have to write this stupid conclusion. So it's very tempting to say, and so you see, I was right. But research shows us that people only remember the last thing that they read. So I go back to my example of you writing an email to your boss. Let's say that you, again, were trying to convince your boss that he or she should give you a raise, or should give you more responsibility, should make you the manager. You would, in your introduction, have laid out how critical that management position is, or how important it is to show your employees that they're appreciated by giving them a raise or whatever. And you would have had your bulleted examples about why you deserve that raise or that promotion or that business trip. But research shows us that of that bulleted list, your boss will only remember the last bullet because it's the last thing she or he reads. So you need to pull it all together into a nice, neat little conclusion. The conclusion should be able to stand on its own. Any one of your readers should be able to take that paragraph, pull it away from your paper, and read it alone, and it should make sense on its own. I will tell you frankly, as a person who's done a lot of research, when I'm confronted with a long paper and I'm not sure if it's worth my time or not, what I do is I go to the conclusion and I read the conclusion. If the writer has made a good case for whatever it is that he or she is trying to prove, then I might say, okay, those 30 pages are worth my time. If it's not a compelling argument, I throw it away. I move on to the next one. So it might seem like, oh, I got to do this last little thing, but it really is an important part of your paper, and it's what a lot of people are going to read first, and it may be the only thing that they read. So if you want to be famous, you need a good conclusion. So the conclusion must stand on its own. First of all, it should summarize your examples. This does not mean that it needs to be 3 paragraphs long, or even that it needs to be a really long paragraph. If you're effective and you're concise, you can actually cram more than one example into a sentence. I have seen as many as 3 examples crammed into a sentence. In the example that I give you in the PowerPoint, my paper had 4 examples, so I did 2 separate sentences with 2 examples each. It doesn't need to be lengthy, but it needs to have enough detail that if somebody hadn't read your paper, they would be convinced by reading just the conclusion. And finally, at the end of the conclusion, you're going to restate your thesis. Basically, you're saying, but much more sophisticated than this, look, I proved it. When you restate your thesis, you need to have new wording because you don't want it to sound like, oh, I was bored, so I just repeated the sentence from up in my introductory paragraph. So you need to find a creative new way to restate it. So once again, your essay is going to look a lot like an Oreo cookie. It's going to have an introduction that sets up the story and helps a reader who's never read this poem to understand what in the world you're talking about. It's going to have your proof. You're going to be trying to convince that jury. And then finally, it will have your conclusion that wraps it all nice and neat with a pretty little red bow. Now moving on, part of our homework assignment that will be due on Friday includes your first Blackboard discussion. You can find this by going to our Blackboard page for this course and clicking on discussions. And I have already released it, so it's up there waiting for you. This is supposed to emulate in the working world where people share ideas online. You may already be involved in chat rooms. This is a little bit different, where people might be trying to solve a problem or might be working on something and they want to see, if I do this, will it make sense? Is it very convincing? I have seen people say, I'm trying to build a new database and I'd like to know what tools are out there, and other people give advice. So I'm trying to emulate that. And in this case, we're doing a little bit of problem solving. So I've set up a question for you, and the question is about the tests that Odysseus and his crew face as they go through their journeys that is recounted in the flashback, where in this portion of the text, where Odysseus is telling the Phaeacians about all the adventures that he and his crew had from the time they left Troy up until the time when he arrived solo on Calypso's island. So we've met a lot of interesting people. We've met the Lotus Eaters, and we've met Circe, and we've met the House of the Dead. Each of these things constitutes a challenge that Odysseus and or his men have faced. And we can equate these tests to things that happen to us in ordinary life. When we talked about the lotus eaters in class, for example, you might remember that we talked about it being not only drugs, it could be equated to drugs, but it also could be equated with being just a little bit too comfortable on your couch or using Facebook or gaming to forget other things that you have to deal with, like that big anatomy test or that darn paper that that darn professor assigned you. Um, so this is what I'm looking for. I've set up a number of threads that relate to each of the tests that Odysseus and his men faced. You don't have to answer all of them. You just pick one of the threads. A thread is a sub portion of the question. So the question is, what do these tests face? You only pick one of them. When you go into the thread, you'll click on it, and you'll see that I set up a sort of sub-question for that thread. If you are the first commenter, you simply lay out your points. If you are not the first person, then you need to acknowledge at least one comment that was made prior to you. You might say, for example, I absolutely agree with what Pam said, but I also have another thought I'd like to add to that. Or, and here's another example. Or you might disagree, which of course we're going to do politely. You might say, I can see why Tom might think that, but I have a different take on this, and here's my view. Or you might even politely disagree. You might say, you know, Tom says this, and I just don't agree, and here's why I think that doesn't make sense. You're never going to insult the person, but you're going to say the argument just doesn't hold water for me. Then you will go on with your content. Repeating the other person's content can be necessary to make your point, but it can't be your whole comment. I will be grading you on substance, meaning what do you say that's unique and how insightful it is. And I'm also going to be grading you on grammar and spelling. So here are some hints. If you want, you can write your submission first in Microsoft Word. Your submission needs to be at least 100 words long, and Word, actually, Word in Mac or Microsoft, doesn't matter, has a word counter, so that can help you to make sure that you have at least 100 words. That would typically be about 3 or 4 sentences long. Look for those little squiggles. The green squiggles mean that you have a grammar problem, and the red squiggles mean that you have some kind of spelling error. And if you right-click on the word or the group of words that have the little squiggles under them, the program will show you how to fix it, or at least give you some hints on how to fix it. So I advise you to take advantage of that, because there's no point in losing points over silly things like grammar and spelling. When you go to copy into Blackboard, the trick is that you can't do what you normally would do to cut and paste. Normally when you paste, you could right-click and a little box would come up that says paste. You get that box, but it doesn't work. So when you get into Blackboard, when you get to the screen where you want to paste it, hit Control plus V, as in Victor. Hold down the Control key and hit the V key, as in Victor. That's the shortcut for paste, and that will paste it into Blackboard, and then you can submit your posting. If you want to draft it directly in Blackboard, you certainly can do that. I will caution you that Blackboard has a timer, and I don't know how long it gives you. So if you're spending a lot of time tweaking and polishing and correcting your grammar, it can time out on you, and then your whole comment disappears. So I just want to make sure that you're aware of that. If you do type it directly into Blackboard, Blackboard itself does not have a grammar checker, but it does have a spelling checker. So it will give you little red squiggles. And again, if you right-click on those little squiggles, it will show you some spelling options so that you don't get points off. So I hope that's helpful. Again, Blackboard discussion is due Friday, January 30th at 9:30. I have set the machine so that at 9:30 the discussion disappears. If you don't do it before then, you cannot submit it late. You get a 0. So hopefully you'll have plenty of time because I've already turned it on, and you can start as soon as you read this video. So that's the end of the technical portion of our presentation for our virtual class, replacing our January 28th class. And stay tuned. Don't forget to click on sections 2, 3, and 4. I do look forward to seeing you on Friday.